Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. How are you guys doing tonight? Hope you're doing well. My channel is Discerning What is True. I am live tonight on YouTube and on Odyssey, and I'm going to continue what I said I was going to do earlier tonight. Read another chapter from Eustace Mullins' works called Murder by Injection. This will be chapter 7 of this particular book. This book was written probably in the mid 80s, or actually late 80s, if you recollect. And we're going to be talking about the chapter 7 called Fertilizer. And so we're going to get into this real quick here. And let's see, it's approximately, well, it's about 10:30 tonight, so it might be my last video tonight. Um, so let's do something real quick here and see what we got here. So one of the great changes in our world during the last 50 years has been the great, what they call the Green Revolution, the so-called agricultural revolution in many parts of the Third World. This revolution was supposed to rapidly bring the Third World countries into the 20th century and allow them to compete on an equal basis with the more advanced Western nations. As the 20th century now recedes into history, it is apparent that this objective has not been achieved. Asian and Latin American countries are offering more competitive are offering more competition in production of finished goods at a much cheaper labor cost. But in agriculture, despite the fact that vast new markets have been created for the Rockefeller chemical operations, the alleviation of poverty, which supposedly was the goal of the Green Revolution, remains a misnomer. In fact, those areas of the world which have long been marked on the maps as undeveloped had no notation of the fact that this was a code word for unexploited. That is not yet exploited by the rapacious international conspirators, you see. The only real interest of the financial years is to develop markets for their products which can return a profit. Because much of the third world countries are unable to pay for goods, a complex system has been developed whereby the American taxpayer sends aid to the third world. Did you know that? He works in a factory to make a tractor. The tractor is then sent to Bolivia, and then a payment for it is extorted from the worker's wage. A further refinement is a system whereby American or international banks lend the money to these countries so that they can pay for the goods. The Federal Reserve then guarantees these uncollected loans with American taxpayers' funds. Once again, the worker has the money extorted from his paycheck to cover the cost of the goods he produces. The framers of the Constitution never envisioned such a development, with the result that when the worker cites the Constitution for relief from that extortion, the judge, that is, indignantly throws him into jail for irrelevant and confusing testimony. The world is now a gulag archipelago. That is from the quote from um, um, not Trotsky. I know the guy. Uh, oh, it's a Russian guy, a Russian writer. I'm sorry. I normally know his name really well. Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn, sorry. Run by the ruthless minions of the Rockefeller Rothschild conglomerate. Its gods are money and power. Its only enemy is the advocates of liberty. The current hero of the Rockefeller interest is Norman Borlaug, who was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, a Iowa farmer, that is. Borlaug had been sent to Mexico by the Rockefeller interest in 1944 to develop new types of grain. During his experiments there, he mated 60,000 different species of wheat, resulting in the creation of an all-tropical race of dwarfs, double dwarfs, and triple dwarfs by 1964. This was hailed as the Green Revolution. The resulting super wheat produces greater yields, but this was done by hyping the soil with huge amounts of fertilizer per acre. The fertilizer being the product of nitrates and petroleum, commodities controlled by the Rockefellers. Huge quantities of herbicides and pesticides were also used, creating additional markets for the Rockefeller chemical empire. In effect, the Green Revolution was merely a chemical revolution, you see. At no point could the third world nations be expected to pay for the huge amount of chemical fertilizers and pesticides. This was again taken care of by the system of foreign aid, which was already in place. The Rockefeller interests also sent Robert Chandler to the Philippines to develop a miracle rice. The result was a rice which used 3 times the previous amount of fertilizer. That rice matured in 4 months instead of the previous 6 months, producing 3 crops a year instead of 2. When 2 Filipino groups of wealthy entrepreneurs began to contest each other for local spinoffs of the province of the miracle rice, the Rockefellers decided to oust one group, the Marcos, that is Kanban, replacing it with a Aquino factor. You remember that? When they took over? Which had close ties to the Chase Manhattan Bank and which could be depended on to pay interest on loans. As usual, Rockefeller philanthropy was closely interlinked with markets, profits, and political control. Modern fertilizer is a petroleum-based industry. At the conclusion of the Second World War, the munitions manufacturers found themselves faced with huge inventories of nitrates. Because of the outbreak of peace, which is always regarded with horror by the philanthropist foundations, new markets had to be found and quickly for these commodities. Nitrogen and nitrates were key ingredients in the manufacture of bombs and shells, and comparably peacetime market had to be developed. Following the precepts which they had established after the First World War, when the monopolists faced with a huge supply of leftover chlorine, which had been manufactured at great expense to cause extensive suffering and death, found that the only possible market was to sell it to the American communities, who would then pour it into their water supplies. It was decided in 1945 that the only outlet for the huge inventory of nitrates was to put it into the food chain as fertilizer. The increasing rate of deaths from heart attacks in the United States the past 50 years has been ingeniously explained by the apologists for the medical monopoly as one more illustration of the fact that Americans were living longer, their advancing years making them more susceptible to degenerative diseases such as cancer and heart trouble. This was the usual cop-out from the medical establishment, which conveniently ignored important advances in the American lifestyle. For a number of years during the 19th century, epidemics of cholera and typhoid fever had devastated the inhabitants of large American cities. The outbreaks being due to poor sanitation and contamination of the water supply. When the monopolists poured their excess chlorine into the water supplies after the First World War, the results were widely hailed as having ended the epidemics of cholera and typhoid fever. In fact, chlorination has not been responsible for this development. Typhoid fever has been largely due to the contamination of city streets by large quantities of horse droppings, which festered and drew flies. When it rained, this contamination was washed into the water supply. With the advent of the automobile and the disappearance of horses from city streets as our main means of transportation, typhoid fever vanished almost overnight. This occurred during the 1920s when automobiles replaced horses on the street. The dumpings of this war material into our water supply did have one unforeseen effect. Let me get a drink glass of water here. Hold on a second. It brought on a new epidemic, the epidemic of heart attacks. You see, the chlorine in the water combined with animal fats in the diets to form a chemical amalgam, which then forms a gummy substance in the arteries. This creates a medical condition called atherosclerosis. The buildup of this gummy substance in the arteries gradually interferes with the circulation of the blood, finally closing off the main arteries to the heart and bringing on the attacks of angina pectoris and coronary heart attacks. Here again, a seemingly advance in hygiene will prove to be yet another boon for the medical monopoly, as the offices of the physicians were filled with Americans suffering from heart disease. Didn't know that, folks. At the conclusion of World War II, the monopolists began a concerted effort to dump their surplus nitrates in the American food chain. County agents throughout the United States were told to advise farmers in their areas to increase their use of fertilizer, herbicides, and pesticides. This advice served to make farming even more capital intensive, forcing the farmers to go to the banks to borrow more money and paving the way for the program of forcing the individual farmer off the land, creating great agricultural monopolies, similar to the ones in the Soviet Agricultural Trust. Farmers also borrowed heavily to buy expensive tractors which ran on gasoline, greatly adding to the Rockefeller revenue, at the same time depriving them of the fertilizer formerly available from their horses, it was hardly coincidental that the banks, which so cheerfully ante up the loans needed by the farmers who faithfully followed the instructions of their county agents, were banks who got their funds from the Federal Reserve System. This monopoly of the nation's money and credit had been planned as a secret meeting of conspirators on Jekyll Island, Georgia, in November of 1910, a meeting presided over by Senator Nelson Aldrich, whose daughter had recently married John D. Rockefeller Jr. They always marry to continue. It's not about love, folks, except maybe the love of money. The traditional value of food grown in heavily fertilized soil, and the fact that these foods didn't undergo extensive processing to render them more convenient for large-scale warehousing, transportation, and retailing, has been glossed over by the medical monopoly, you see. A protesting voice was heard when Dr. H. M. Sinclair, a leading nutritionist and head of the Laboratory of Human Nutrition at Magdalen College in Oxford, gave a 1957 World Health Day address, which was reprinted on the British Medical Journal December 14, 1957. Dr. Sinclair recalled that from his earliest days as a medical student, my clinical teachers could not answer why the expectation of life in this country or this century of the middle-aged man is hardly different from what it was at the beginning of the century, or even a century ago. This means that despite the great advances in medicine, that is, pneumonia almost abolished, tuberculosis comparatively rare, magnificent advances in surgery, the endocrinological and public health, a middle-aged man cannot expect to live more than 4 years longer than he could a century ago. And indeed, in Scotland, the expectation of life is now actually decreasing. And again, this is based upon 1980s info. In 1893, a German agricultural chemist, Dr. Julius Hensel, wrote in his book, Bread from Stones, agriculture has entered into the sign of cancer. We cannot be indifferent to what kind of crops we raise for our nourishment or with what substance our fields are fertilized. It cannot be all sufficient that great quantities are harvested, but that great quantities must also be of good quality. It is indisputable that by merely fertilizing with MARL, i.e. with carbonate of lime, such a large yield may be attained as to make a man inclined to always content himself with mar. But with such a one-sided fertilization, slowly but surely, evil effects of various kinds will develop. These have given rise to the axiom of experience, that is, manuring with lime makes rich fathers but poor sons. As our present fine flour, freed from bran, furnished almost entirely devoid of nutrients, we need not wonder at the great number of modern maladies. This was written in 1893 before the Rockefeller interests flooded the world with their petroleum-based fertilizers. So what he's talking about, that when they were using manure, but they added lime, it made rich fathers but poor sons. The fathers, made money, but their sons suffered health-wise, because at that time the present fine flour was freed from bran. It furnished almost entirely no nutrients. In fact, the part of the wheat crop, if we call it, the important part actually went to the cattle. It did not go to the human beings. So the bread you get these days has hardly got very little nutrition in it. Go back to what I was saying here. To counteract the growing array of inert nutritional deficiency foods, the minions of the medical monopoly have not been idle. While conducting wars of attrition against the leading exponents of better nutrition, the Food and Drug Administration and the American Medical Association have valiantly defended the use of chemical fertilizers. The widely circulated AMA magazine, that is, Today's Health, found in every public school and library in September 1958, stated, quote, extensive research conducted by the federal government has shown that the nutritional value of crops is not affected by the soil or the fertilizer use. Oh, wow, really? That's about as asinine statement I can ever see. What does it do? And that's my comment. This was contradicted by the Rockefeller Foundation own Dr. Alexius Carrel, who wrote, chemical fertilizers, by increasing the abundance of the crops, without replacing all the exhausted elements of the soil have indirectly contributed to change the nutritional value of cereal grains, and vegetables. Hens have been compelled by artificial diet and mode of living to enter the ranks of mass producers. Has not the quality of their eggs been modified? The same question may be asked about milk, because cows are now confined to the stable all year round and are fed with manufactured provident. Hygienists have not paid sufficient attention to the genesis of diseases. There's studies of conditions of life and diet and of their effect on the physiological and mental state of the modern man are superficially incomplete and of too short duration. Despite the claims of government researchers, the importance of soil is shown by the fact that the proportion of iron in lettuce can vary from 1 milligram per 100 to 50 milligram per 100, according to the conditions of the soil in which it is grown. The Middle West has long been known as the Goiter Belt, Goiter belt, because of a widespread deficiency of iodine in the soil. That's correct. The British Isles, which have been heavily farmed for almost 2,000 years, had such deficiency of minerals in the soil that the British are known the world over for their bad teeth. The present system of agricultural chemistry was fathered by Dr. Justin von Liebig, Liebig, a German chemistry professor who suggested that minerals should be added to the soil and acids added to make them more available to plants. Chemistry agriculture uses soluble chemicals which are either acidic or basic, their final effect being to acidify the soil, which is not good, folks. While the use of chemical minerals renders the soil useless, it's been suggested that we are still living on the benefits conferred by the last glacial age, and that the only way to remineralize the soil is to undergo another glacial age, as has previously happened about 100,000 years ago. Dr. W.M. Albrecht, chairman of the Department of Soils at the University of Missouri School of Agriculture, stated, while it has long been common belief that disease is an infliction visited upon us from without, there is a growing recognition that it possibly originates from within because of deficiencies and failure to nourish ourselves completely. Fuller knowledge of nutrition is revealing mounting numbers of cases of deficiency disease. These tend to be traced not only to the supplies in the food and supermarkets where the family budget may provide them, but a bit further and closer to their origin, namely the fertilization of the soil, the point at which all agricultural production takes off. These increasing cases classified as deficiencies are voicing the truth of that old adage which told us that to be well fed is to be healthy. Many of the strange new diseases which have arisen to plague us in recent years are found to have a nutritional origin. Dr. Josephson, that is, identifies myasthenia gravis is an intricate disorder resulting from deficiency of manganese, which may be caused either by defective assimilation of manganese or by defective metabolism. The need for chemical fertilizers may have stemmed from a long-standing flaw in the methods of farming, the use of what they call a moldborer plow. Edward H. Faulkner, professor at the University of Oklahoma, discovered that the moldborer plow was destroying the fertility of the soil. He counteracted this effect by disking green manure into the surface and eliminating the plow, an instrument which sandwiches virtually all green manure, that is, decaying plant matter and vegetable residue found on the surface of the ground, some 6 to 8 inches below the surface, where it forms a barrier to water, which should rise from the water table. The upper 6 inches then becomes dry, as the capillary action of water movement is blocked. Plants grow on this plow depleted soil attracts insects, while their vitamins and mineral content is depleted. The plants become sickly and die. Seeing this result, the farmer then decides that the problem is the lack of some element in the soil, not realizing that it is the plow which has interfered with the capillary action of water in the soil. He then becomes a ready customer for large quantities of chemical fertilizers. Someone did that on purpose, you see. One of the principal producers of these fertilizers was a Rockefeller-controlled American Agricultural and Chemical Company. Not surprising, one of its directors, John C. Trappenhagen, was also a director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and the Rockefeller Institute of Medicine, a prime mover and director of the American Cancer Society. That is, Trappenhagen was president of the Bank of New York and director of the Fifth Avenue Bank. He was also a director of the WYAND Chemicals, the Hudson Insurance, Brokers Insurance and Brokers and Shipping Insurance, Caledonian American Insurance, Foreign Bondholders Protective Association, Sun Insurance Limited, one of the three principal Rothschild firms, the Atlantic Mutual Insurance, Eagle Fire Insurance, Norwich Union Fire Insurance Limited, International Nickel, Royal Insurance Company, Royal Liverpool Insurance, and many other London insurance firms, most of whom were within the Rothschild orb. Also on the board of American Agricultural Company was John Follis Dulles of the Wall Street law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. He served as Eisenhower's Secretary of State while his brother Alan was head of the CIA. That doesn't sound right. Doesn't have two brothers in the government at two high positions? That smells rotten, doesn't it, folks? Doesn't that tell you something going on here? Dulles was also the director of International Nickel, that is the Bank of New York, American Banknote Company, which furnished the paper used by the Federal Reserve System to print its paper money, which was backed by paper bonds, and chairman of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, of which Alger Hiss was president, director of the New York Public Library. He was also involved with the Union Theological Seminary and the New York State Banking Board. Dulles had been secretary at the Hague Peace Conference in 1907 and served as his uncle's secretary at the Paris Peace Conference in 1918. Robert Lansing, Wilson's Secretary of State, was Dulles later served on the Reparations Commission and the Supreme Economic Council with Bernard Baruch in 1919. He attended the Berlin Debt Conference in 1933 and was American delegate to the United Nations in San Francisco, along with Alger Hiss, who wrote the United Nations Charter in 1945. Now, here's the key, folks. Here's the key. Let's just put it together right here. Alger Hiss was a communist. So let's just connect those things together. They actually wrote the charter for the United Nations, you see. And eventually, Alger Hiss was actually declared a communist and was killed, along with his wife. Most are not aware of that. I take that back. I don't know if it is his wife. I just say Alger Hiss was actually was killed because he was a spy for the communists. But Dulles and brother Alan had attended a historical conference with Baron Kurt von Schuler and Adolf Hitler in Cologne in 1933. You hear that? When the Dulles brothers assured Hitler that Wall Street bankers would advance him the money to launch his Nazi regime in Germany, they found their enemy. They created another artificial enemy here, folks. Do you not see this? It's very clear. Eustace Mullins has done all this work. I was listening to something last night. Eustace Mullins spent his almost entire life at one point, which he sees that no one could connect what he connected. This is what people don't understand. He researched sometimes as many as 250 to 275, if not more, sources to put together a book. And the only best library was the Library of Congress. Now, who has that opportunity to do that? Very few people do, you see. And he was single, and that was an advantage of that. But he was also, the main thing simply was that he had a good man who gave support to him, was Ezra Pound, not money-wise, but believed in him. You see, it's amazing what you can do when someone believes in you. Also on the board of American Agriculture was, I already said that. Okay, gotten off the tangent here. Also on the board of American Ag and Champ was George C. Clark, the investment banker Clark and Dodge, John R. Dillon, chairman of the Unansel, that's why what's the name, Unansel Chemical Company, Lone Star Cement, and was also a theater tycoon, director of National Theaters, 20th Century Fox, Scortius Theaters, and also an aircraft tycoon as director of Curtiss Wright and Wright Aeronautics. Also on the board was banker Robert Stone, partner of Hayden Stone, director of Rockefeller, Masabit Iron Ore and Island Greek Coal Company, the Ponto Algeria Sugar Company, U.S. Envelope, John P. Chase Company, Philadelphia Norfolk Steamship Company, and Amosky Company, and William Whitmore Company. Another member of the Ag and Chem was Elliott B. V is in Victor Bell, who was also the director of the American Cancer Society. He had been a financial writer for the New York Times from 1929 to 1939, which gave him entree into the highest financial circles. He became economic advisor to Thomas Dewey. In 1940, he's the one that Thomas Dewey ran against Eisenhower, or Truman? Might be Truman. Yes, Truman. Thomas Dewey in 1940, superintendent of banks for New York State from 1947 to 49, director of McGraw-Hill, which is a publisher, editor of the business magazine called Business Week, director of Rockefeller's Chase Manhattan Bank, New York Life, New York Telephone Company, Tricontinental Corporation, Revere Copper and Brass, and other firms, which Revere Copper is the ones who make copper-based pots, which were very famous back in the 50s and 60s. They were made. He also was appointed to the Committee on Social Security Finance for HEW and trustee of the John S. Guggenheim Foundation, the Roger Strauss Foundation. His daughter is a leading New York socialite, Mrs. Thomas Hovingen, H-O-V-I-N-G, one of the beautiful people. I don't know what that means. She must have been an attractive woman. The use of chemical fertilizers caused the protein content of the vegetables to drop steadfastly at the rate of 10% a year. You see. However, the most dangerous effect and the probable cause of much nutritional-induced diseases was the fact that chemical fertilizer reduced the amount of potassium in the soil, while increasing the amount of sodium. Potassium and sodium are the leaders of the two electrical opposite groups. Did you hear that? Because we are electrical. You see that? Inactive potassium in the system precipitates illness, especially cancer. The increased sodium may explain the dramatic increase in the incidence of high blood pressure throughout the United States, because our population is ingesting steadily increasing amount of sodium from foods grown in chemical fertilizer soil, while simultaneously suffering from the effects of steadily declining levels of potassium in the human system. Potassium is especially necessary for the regulation of the heartbeat. It lacks in the body makes the system prone to sudden heart attacks. Nutritionists now believe that the use of chemical fertilizer in the soil causes 70% of all anemia in the citizens of the United States, because these fertilizers do not replace iron in the soil, but actually remove it. The use of chemical fertilizers also accelerates the domination of the world's grain supplies by large corporations which are closely affiliated with the Rockefeller interests. So let me just write this down here. He's saying simply there are issues with the lack of potassium, and he's also talking about another issue here with too much sodium and not much potassium in the soil. And he says basically you have to have those things in order to continue to not to have heart attacks. You see. The increase of sodium may explain the dramatic increase also the incidence of high blood pressure throughout the United States, because our population is ingesting steadily increasing amount of sodium for foods. So it's basically what he's saying simply is that the sodium part. Anyway, I've gotten off on a tangent here. Let's continue. The use of chemical fertilizers also accelerated the domination of the world's grain supply by large corporations which are closely affiliated with the Rockefeller interests. In 1919, the largest grain grower in the world was the Montana Farming Corporation. At that time, wheat was selling for a guaranteed price of $2.20 a bushel, and the combine was raking in huge profits. Montana Board of Directors was headed by J.P. Morgan, whose vast interest in banking, steel, and railroad had given no inklings of his desire to become a farmer. Morgan was serving on the Federal Advisory Council of the Federal Reserve Board, representing the New York Central banking area. His associates on the board of Montana Farming were Rockefeller's banker, James Stillman of the National City Banker. Two of his daughters married two sons of William Rockefeller, that is, Francis Hinckley Siston, vice president of the Morgan Control Bank, and Guarantee Trust is now called Morgan Guarantee Trust, Charles D. Norton, whom Morgan placed a President Taft personal secretary during the Taft presidency. Norton served as the president of Morton's First National Bank, later merged with Rockefeller National Six Banks to form the present banking giant called Citibank. Norton has been one of the original conspirators present at the Jekyll Island to secretly draft the Federal Reserve Act. He was the director of the Montgomery Ward. He was also the Equity Life ATT, Tidewater Oil, and the Delaware and Lackawanna Railroad. He was also director of a number of Morgan's favorite charities, the American Red Cross, the Russell Sage Foundation, and the Metropolitan Museum. Also on the board of Montana Farming was Charles H. Sabin, S-A-B-I-N, a director of Guarantee Trust, Merchants and Metals Nation Bank, president of the Asian Banking Corporation, American Foreign Securities Corporation, the Mackay Companies, Postal Telegraph, and many other firms. Today, the world grain trade is firmly in the hands of 5 farms. And actually, that's changed too, also. I say that today, world's grain trade is firmly in the hands of 5 firms. Cargill is one of them. The other one is ADM. And then you have some what I call foreigners. The 2 ones I just mentioned, Cargill and ADM, are the 2 major ones here in America. And he's got Continental Grain, what I would assume that's a merger with that, ADMM. Louis Dreyfus and Bunge, B-U-N-G-E, and Andre. These firms have waxed rich and powerful by riding the tide of super grain development by the Rockefeller Trust. They maintain close contact with these interests, and the banking interests of the Rockefellers relying principally on the Chase Manhattan International Network. These firms have also profited from the Rockefeller Foundation development of hybrid seeds, notably that is corn. From a commercial standpoint, the attraction of the hybrids is that they cannot reproduce themselves. As a result, the farmers has to ante up the money to buy a new supply of the hybrid seeds each year. Hybrid seeds have another great attraction for the monopolists. They give the parent company, which owns the patent, a monopoly of that particular variety of seed. Thus, we have the twin factors of commercial viability and monopoly to give the banks and the chemical trusts a stranglehold on the American farmer. Hybrid seeds yield an average increase of 20 to 30% more per acre, which is a strong selling point to the farmer. Likewise, the miracle wheat, which was originated at the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center at El Buntain, Mexico, resulting in the development of wheat strain which could stand up under the force of lashing rain and tropical storms. It was produced by crossing Mexican wheat with the strains of Japanese dwarf, which had short, tough stems. Norwin 10 from the island of Honshu was hardy enough to stand up under Japanese typhoons. It became the type which made the Green Revolution a reality. After 1960, the Mexican station released a long line of wheats. They were called Nanair, N-A-N-A-I-R, 60 for the year 1960. Pitic, P-I-T-I-C, 62. Pajama, 62. Sonora, 64. Lerman Rojo, 64. India, 66. 60. Cerolas, 66. Super X, 67. Yakult, 70, and Cajun, 71. Although they required intensive fertilizing and irrigation, they all could thrive in tropical countries. The Big Five wield enormous political and financial power because of their enormous cash flow, and because so many governments depend on their food supply to maintain political stability. This was demonstrated during what we call the historical, now called the Great Soviet Grain Robbery in 1972. This was arranged by Henry Kissinger, longtime Rockefeller stooge from the Chase Manhattan Bank. This deal baited out the tottering Soviet government while costing American taxpayers many billions. In July 1972, the Soviet Union bought wheat from the United States in an attempt to compensate for the disastrous incompetency of the Soviet communal system of agriculture. That was when we could have actually destroyed the country. We could have brought them to their knees, folks. But money's always a way of destroying, you know what I mean? Had a chance to actually destroy a competitor. Or not a competitor, but an enemy. In 1963, Russia had begun a policy of purchasing wheat from abroad by buying 6.8 tons from Canada for $500 million. Pay for the purchase from the United States in 1972, the Soviet Union was allowed to cover the payment in the following manner. The Central Bank of Hungary, acting for the Soviet Union, placed an order to sell the dollar short for $20 billion. You hear that? Secretary of the Treasury John Connally, who was from Texas, then devalued the dollar by 10% more. So the Soviet Union made $4 billion on its short selling of the dollar and paid for the grain. This is from Michelle Sidoria, who had been deeply involved with the Rothschilds and the Hambro family, international financial manipulators, described the process from his prison cell, where he was later found dead. In the Fabulous Naivete, the United States has provided the Soviet Union with $4 billion, money that since doubtless been invested in the destruction of his benefactors. I began to see then that America was the consort of his own ruin. Well, we have spies in our country. That's what goes on. I tell you, in all of history, no power has so blindly armed and supported its enemy as she has. Talking about us. The Soviet grain deal resulted in increasing the price of all food supplies in the United States by 20% because of restrictions imposed by Congress on shipping grains in foreign vessels. We've got some assholes. These people are destroying and been doing destroying our country, undermining our country. They have nothing. They're not our people, folks. They're not. They're your own enemy. A measure which has been passed to aid our dwindling maritime fleet, the Soviet grain purchase in 1972 cost the American taxpayer additional $55 million in subsidies to bulk carriers. In other words, we had to use other carriers to send the wheat over there. The American carriers shipped the grain for $16 a ton, although foreign vessels would have carried it for $9 a ton. Wow. To this day, only a few international grain traders and the Soviet official actually know the price charged for 40 million tons of grain, which the Soviets brought from the United States between 1971 and 77. Officials at the U.S. Department of Agriculture state they had no records on the price paid. Bullshit. Or whether it was ever paid. Well, that might be true. Only Henry Kissinger knows, and he is not telling. Of course he's not. The big five grain dealers are also heavily involved in currency manipulation, trading vast sums each day in currency futures because their grain deals cause great fluctuation in the valuation of world currency. Did you know that? With their inside track, they make huge profits whether the value of this currency moves up or down. Cargill, that is, now has 25% of the world's grain trade. Bunge, B-U-N-G-E, of Argentina has 20%. Continental Grain began operations during the Napoleon War, supplying grain to both sides and had 25% of the world grain trade. The present head of the firm, Michael Friedberg, owns 90% of the stock, with his son René. Michel Friedberg was a French citizen who joined the U.S. Army intelligence during World War II. He subsequently became a U.S. citizen. Andrea, a Swiss family belonging to a strict set of Swiss Calvinists who are members of the worldwide and very militant Plymouth Brethren, and Dreyfus, which had 20% of the world's grain trade. Dreyfus is now headed by Nathaniel Samuels, who serves on President Nixon's team as Undersecretary for Economic Affairs. The chairman of the Bunge, Walter Klein, whose office is at the 1 Chase Manhattan Plaza, New York, is a policy-making official of the U.S. and USSR Trade and Economic Council. Do you get it? These people are working, they're actually banking, and they're also working for the government in order to benefit themselves. That's what they're doing. That's what they're doing. That's what he's saying. You see what he's saying here? So that's the conclusion of Chapter 7, dealing with what we call fertilizers. So I appreciate you all being here. And again, we'll have, I think, a couple more chapters of this particular book, I think, is left. Looks like there's, yes, there's going to be 3 more chapters, 8, 9, and 10 is what I recollect. And then that will be the end of this particular book called Murder by Injection. So a reason why I'm not broadcasting this on Facebook at this point is simply Facebook gave me a strike when I talked about an issue that really has nothing to do with what's going on today, but they supposedly connected and gave me a red mark, so to speak. So that's the reason why it's not on Facebook, because I just basically do not want to lose my Facebook friendship deal. So anyway, I wish you a good night. And thank you for listening. And I wish you, like I said, a good night. And you take care.